I will be remembered as the guy who just wrote American Psycho. It'd be impossible to even try to, outdo that. And I also have no desire to outdo that. I'm perfectly fine with that being the thing that I'm most known for. The first time I saw Christian Bale as Patrick Bateman was years before the movie was made. The director, Mary Harron, who already had my blessing about Christian Bale, wanted me to meet him. She wanted the author of the book to be happy and to be on board with her vision of the film. The studio did not want Christian Bale, but they cut down the budget. Okay, you can have Christian Bale. Christian was in LA and he was staying at a hotel, and then we were going to go down to dinner in West Hollywood, and I opened the door and he was Patrick Bateman. He had the mullet, he had the suit on, he had the accent. And I was really shocked. And so I got to meet Patrick Bateman that night, and I didn't like it. And I told Christian to stop it after a while, that he didn't need to do this, because he was really in Patrick Bateman's mode as we drove down to the restaurant, as we went into the restaurant, as we sat down at the table, and then we were joined by Mary. And I had to just say, I get it. I mean, Mary, give him the role so we will not have to endure dinner with him. So I had already seen it before and I'd been on the set a couple of times and saw what he was doing. He made an indelible mark on that movie, because I could never picture Patrick Bateman. I never had a face. I never had any inclination of how he looked throughout the 3 years I wrote it, and then during its publishing history, until Christian Bale played that role. And I can't get that out of my head. And I think it might be difficult for readers to get Christian Bale out of their head if they've seen the movie and they start reading the book. And that just sometimes happens. That happens with great performances in movies. I mean, whether it's Vivien Leigh as Scarlett O'Hara, whether it's Jack Nicholson in The Shining, or whether it's James Mason as Humbert Humperdinck in Lolita. There's just certain people in cinematic adaptations of novels that are so good and so indelible that you can't ever get them out of your mind. I live with a millennial. I've lived with a millennial for 10 years. Half of my friends are millennials, and I like some millennial art. There's one section in this book where I kind of generalize, somewhat jokingly, somewhat seriously, about what I've gleaned about millennials over the years by living with one and having millennial friends. And there are annoyances, there's some complaining for my part, but then it's wrapped up in a paragraph where I say I completely understand why they are the way they are. And I'm looking at them through the eyes of a very jaundiced generation that wasn't an aspirational generation, that was a kind of negative, nihilistic generation. And so, of course, I have this take on millennial culture, but I'm also incredibly sympathetic to it as well, and to what their burdens are. And I don't think that is written about, because that's not clickbait. That's not going to sell an article. Me bemoaning millennial generation that's hot. There are certain reasons why millennials are the way they are, because outside forces beyond social media have caused that. I mean, economic discomfort. They've gone through 2 wars, 9/11, a president they hate. There's a reason to understand why millennials are as messed up as they are. Millennial culture didn't come of age in a vacuum. It came of age in a response to the generation that preceded it. What do I make of the Marvel movies? I don't think any of them are great. I do think that as a business, as a reflection of corporate culture, they're kind of a triumph. Certainly no one expected Iron Man, the first Marvel movie, to be any good and to have any kind of originality. And yet Marvel found an actor in Robert Downey Jr. who brought enough humor, enough self-reflexive humor to that role to really sell that movie. And also, it looked pretty spectacular for then, for 2008, I believe. And the movies are getting to be more inclusive and progressive in certain ways, though in many ways they're just as conservative and fascist as you can imagine, in terms of they really do believe in the police state. They believe in order, they believe in control. They're throwbacks to a certain time and a certain way of thinking. They're no more different in many ways than the Dirty Harry films of the 70s, which also believed in order, that policing will fix everything, that we have an obligation to protect the world at any cost. And though Marvel does kind of have its qualms about that at times, and sometimes that's woven into the scripts, it usually ends with it being a triumph of the Marvel characters. But it is the most successful reflection of art in corporate culture that we have. And I understand why a lot of people think that's depressing. And the success of the Marvel movies are depressing. But I don't necessarily. I think if they were really bad, perhaps I'd feel that way. But they're mostly okay, and they're mostly well made. They spend enough money on them to be well made. Edgar Wright is one of many who suffered the corporate dictum that has been laid down about these films. You know, people have been fired, and also I think the other problem is that sometimes people are hired. I mean, certainly the directors of Solo, the Star Wars movie, were fired about 70% of the shoot in, or maybe about 50 or 60, and Ron Howard took over, who really is not a visionary director at all, but is a craftsman and knows how to get the job done. And someone like Edgar Wright is not the right fit anymore for these movies, and they want people who are kind of blandly impersonal to put these movies together. It does seem like it's the end of Twitter right now. It does seem that it has been co-opted into this inauthentic world that it didn't seem when it first started. It seemed very authentic, very real, exposing people's contradictory natures, their base humor, what they really thought about stuff, a kind of fearlessness of opinion, and that is more or less gone because it's under now the corporate dictum. And as you say, you know, fake accounts and who are kind of channeling the corporate rule book are everywhere. It's a very different place, but that's not only Twitter, it's a lot of other places as well. It seems the whole culture is following this. And what's so strange is that no one likes it, and yet we're all following it. What's up with that? You hope that things are cyclical and that there'll be pushback on this, and then we'll get to a place where there is a loosening of this kind of self-censoring corporate language police that seem to be following everyone around, dictating what you can say and what you can't say. I have been mobbed or mob trolled on Twitter a number of times. And when that first started happening, I realized, oh, Twitter is actually a virtue signaling machine, and people are now using it in different ways than how I used to use it, and they seem to be locating a person's entire humanity in a cheeky, offensive tweet. And that was when I realized that there was something dangerous in the air. And yes, that was when I began to get mob trolled. You know, all you do is you ignore it, you don't participate with it, and that kind of makes you wonder, why am I on this side in the first place? If I can't really have a back and forth with anybody, which, by the way, is not what Twitter is for, but when the mob comes after you and you don't fight back because it's useless, then I kind of wonder, why am I on this? What is the point of being on this in the first place? Certainly, it's a good way to promote stuff, I suppose, though not much better than Facebook. Sometimes it's a place where I get all of my news feeds, but I have less and less tolerance for Twitter as each day goes by. I do feel that my millennial partner is distracted to death by the amount of choice he has. And he never learned to kind of curate the way we did in the analog era, where, okay, I wasn't born when Bob Dylan first started out, or when the Rolling Stones started out, or even when the Beatles started out. And I didn't know a lot of their more obscure records, and I made an attempt to find out about them. And I would go to a record store and I'd look them up, and then I'd take them home and I'd play them. The same with novels, and then I'd wait for movies at revival theaters that I maybe about famous filmmakers that I wasn't allowed to see because I wasn't born yet, from the 1950s and 1960s. And so I made a real effort to educate myself, and it was invaluable. It was invaluable. And I had the patience to do so because I wasn't distracted by everything around us. I wasn't distracted by 50 screens. So I do cherish that, and I'm glad that I lived through that era. But definitely for me, well, not only for me, everything does seem much more disposable now. I don't know what my partner doesn't get through the internet. I don't know what he doesn't get. He gets food, he gets pornography, he gets news, he gets everything from the internet. My boyfriend can easily come into the bedroom in the middle of a movie, sit down, watch about 20 minutes of it, go, interesting, leave, then come back in another 20 minutes, just watch this segment of the movie. And he has this kind of disassociative relationship to film and to music and even to television to a degree. And I find that might add to his stress levels and his anxiety in a way. I mean, if you're looking at art that way, you're also probably experiencing the world on that way. And that is probably a little problematic because his stress levels are much higher than mine. If you have that much sexual imagery available to you, does that really mean you're going to work harder at actually getting it, at actually having that kind of sexual experience? And people say that millennials are having less sex than any generation ever. And I wonder sometimes if it's connected to the unbelievable amount and variation of porn that they're allowed access to. I mean, I'm shocked at the amount of porn that I'm allowed access to compared to the days when you would have to buy a magazine. And that magazine would satisfy you for a month, or maybe 2 magazines would satisfy you for a month, or maybe a VHS tape with 4, separate scenes in it. Now, you can go through 30 scenes within a couple of minutes and find the one that you find most, now, erotic. On one level, that's great. And for someone like me who grew up without having that kind of availability and access, it also made me want to actually go out and find people and be with people and have a sexual life. I'm not sure that's necessarily what is happening now, because I can honestly say if I had all of that, I don't know if I would have busted my ass going out on dates and meeting people and trying to get with them. It definitely fills a need, it fills a desire, and it kind of kills the notion of actually going out and finding it. That might be a Gen X alarmist attitude, but I think the studies kind of bear it out. Well, I describe it in the book. I think he sees an individual. I think he sees a gangster. I think he sees someone who is a truth teller without being literal. I think he sees someone who's kind of a metaphor. He sees someone who is his own man, whether you love him or loathe him. He doesn't take shit from anybody, which is something that Kanye likes a lot. And I think Kanye has always responded to Trump. He was talking about Trump in 2016 at this concert my boyfriend was at in San Jose, where he said, if I would have voted, I would have voted for Trump. Kim Kardashian, who I have interviewed before, Kim came over and we had a long conversation, and she was telling me that she's not particularly into Trump, but she's going to use him. And she's going to use him for her prison reform stuff, and she's going to get that lady out of prison. And that is how she and Kanye think of how you would use the president. Use your celebrity to get what you want out of him. Certainly Leonardo DiCaprio did the same thing in November after the election, went to see Trump, wanted to make sure that whatever was going on with Leo's Green Global company was going to be okay, and that hopefully the administration would try to work with them. And I think if more celebrities had done that, I don't know, we might have been in a different place, in a different conversation. Trump happened. He is in the White House. And he won, supposedly legally and fairly. So the people spoke. The people spoke. Maybe it was only 75,000 who pushed those electoral maps into the red, but they spoke. And okay, you might be upset about it, but wait until 4 more years and get someone and vote him out. But don't be just writhing in pain in front of the television set all day long because the orange monster is in the White House. I mean, there's other ways to protest. Cunning, and not getting so emotional and not drowning in a kind of childish rage because Trump doesn't care. He doesn't really care about the resistance, doesn't really care that you don't like him. And I would think that you'd have better things to do with your time. And maybe that's canvass, maybe that's go out and find a candidate, maybe that's ignore him, or conversely do what Kim did. Try to work with him on certain things and let that be a way for you to deal with your disappointment and what you feel is the unfairness of that particular election. I don't know why people should go by white. I'll be honest with you. I'm not sure. Sometimes I think if you're Bret Easton Ellis completist, it's a satisfying read. I think if you're interested to a degree in what's happening in America in terms of how the media is covering things and what's happened to a faction of the left, it'll be interesting to you. And it'll be interesting if you're fascinated by Patrick Bateman, because I talk a lot in the book about how I created him and how he's haunted me. And I think those sections, and where he might be now. But it really is, I think, a reflection of where my country's ended up. And in some ways, after being in England these past 2 weeks, there's a lot of connections between what's going on in Britain and what's going on in America at this point.